I was 29 and miserable when a street photographer stopped me and asked to take my picture. He used an old Polaroid camera, waited for it to develop, then handed me the print. But it wasn't the photo he'd just taken. It showed me smiling, surrounded by familiar strangers, doing work I'd never created, in a place I'd never been. "This is you in 1 year," he said, "when you stop resisting." Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared into the crowd. Before we dive in, have you ever made a choice that scared you but changed everything? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories about transformation and following intuition, please subscribe so you don't miss our next one. Now let me take you back to the day I met the photographer who showed me my future. I had a feeling I was living the wrong life. I worked as a data analyst for a pharmaceutical company in San Francisco. The job paid well, $75,000 a year, good benefits, the kind of corporate position my parents were proud to tell their friends about. I wore business casual clothes, sat in a cubicle under fluorescent lights, and spent 8 hours a day building spreadsheets and running statistical models for drug trial data. I was good at it. I was also dying inside. I'd graduated with a degree in graphic design 6 years ago, full of dreams about working for creative agencies, designing brand identities, making beautiful things that meant something. But the job market had been brutal. After 6 months of graduation and 50 rejections, I continued the data analyst job I had started midway through college to help pay for it. I said it was temporary, just until something better came along. 6 years later, I was still there. Still telling myself it was temporary, still spending my evenings too exhausted to work on my portfolio, too discouraged to apply for design jobs, too afraid to take the risk of leaving stability for uncertainty. Just climbing the corporate ladder I didn't remember wanting to climb in the first place. My relationship had ended 3 months ago. Lucas and I had been together for 2 years, and he'd been perfectly fine. That was the problem. Everything about my life was perfectly fine. Safe, stable, comfortable. There was no sparkle. I felt like I was sleepwalking through someone else's life, going through motions that made sense on paper but felt hollow in practice. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, I left work early. I'd finished my tasks, and the thought of sitting in that cubicle for another 2 hours was unbearable. I told my supervisor I had a dentist appointment and left. San Francisco was gray and drizzly. November weather. I walked without destination, just needing to be outside, to move, to feel like I was going somewhere even if I had no idea where that was. I ended up wandering past art galleries and boutiques I couldn't afford, watching people who seemed to have lives they'd chosen rather than lives they'd settled for. That's when I saw him. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a weathered face. He wore a brown cardigan and carried an old Polaroid camera, the kind from the 1980s that instantly printed photos. He was standing on a corner, occasionally approaching people and asking if he could photograph them. Most people said no and kept walking, but there was something about him, a gentleness, a lack of aggressive street performer energy that made him seem harmless. When he approached me, I almost said no, but something made me stop. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but clear. "May I take your photograph?" "Why?" He smiled. "Because you look like someone who needs to see something." It was a strange answer, but I was feeling strange myself, disconnected and aimless and willing to do anything that wasn't sitting in my apartment alone. "Okay," I said. He raised the Polaroid camera, looked at me through the viewfinder, and clicked. The camera whirred and ejected a square print. He took it carefully, holding it by the edges, and waited for it to develop. I waited too, feeling slightly awkward standing on a street corner with a stranger. As the image slowly appeared, I expected to see what he just photographed. Me in my work clothes, standing on that same street, a half smile, looking tired and sad. But when he handed me the fully developed photo, I stared at it in confusion. The woman in the photograph was me. I recognized my face, my hair, my general build, but everything else was different. I was smiling, really smiling, not a polite, posed smile, but a genuine expression of happiness that I barely recognized because I hadn't felt it in years. I was wearing clothes I'd never owned, a bright yellow sweater and jeans that looked comfortable rather than professional. I was standing in what looked like an art place, some kind of market or fair. In my hands was a portfolio or folder with what appeared to be design work, colorful, artistic, nothing like the spreadsheets I created at work. And beside me were people I'd never met. A woman with short, dark hair, laughing at something, a man with glasses, looking at the portfolio I was holding. Both of them seemed familiar in a way I couldn't explain, like I should know them but didn't. "I'm confused. This isn't me," I said, looking up at the photographer. "I mean, it looks like me, but this isn't the photo you just took." "It's you in 1 year, when you stop resisting who you actually are." "What? That doesn't make any sense. You can't photograph the future." "I don't photograph the future. I photograph the version of you that already exists, the one you're too afraid to become. This is some kind of trick. You edited this somehow, or this camera has some kind of AI installed. Look at the photo. Really look at it. Does that feel like a trick? Or does it feel like truth?" I looked again, at my smile, at the work in my hands, at the space surrounded by art, at the people who looked like they might be friends rather than coworkers. It felt like truth, like a glimpse of a life I wanted but had convinced myself was impossible. "How did you—" But when I looked up, the photographer was walking away, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. I stood there holding the photograph, feeling like I had experienced something I couldn't explain. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't stop looking at the photo. I'd tucked it into my bag, but I kept pulling it out, studying the details, trying to understand how he'd created it. The rational part of my brain said it was impossible. You can't photograph something that hasn't happened yet. It had to be some elaborate trick. Maybe he used AI or Photoshop or some technique I didn't understand. But the irrational part, the part I'd been ignoring for years, whispered something different. What if it was real? What if that version of me actually existed somewhere, just waiting for me to become her? I went to work the next day and sat in my cubicle, looking at the same spreadsheets, feeling the same hollow emptiness. During lunch, I pulled out the photo again and studied it. I tried to place it, but I couldn't recognize it from anywhere I'd been before. The people beside me were complete strangers. The work I was holding was too blurry to make out details, but I could see colors and shapes that suggested design work, not data analysis. "What you looking at?" I jumped and shoved the photo back into my bag. My coworker Tom was standing by my cubicle with his lunch. "Nothing, just a photo." "Cool. Hey, you want to grab a drink after work Friday? A few of us are going to that new bar downtown." "Maybe. I'll let you know." Tom walked away, and I felt a wave of sadness. I had tried going out with coworkers a few times before, but each time I felt worse than if I hadn't gone. I seemed to have nothing in common with them. I didn't understand their dreams and lifestyles, and they didn't understand mine. I just couldn't connect. This was my life. Polite conversations with coworkers I didn't really know. Maybe drinks on Friday that would be fine but forgettable. Weekends spent recovering from the week, too tired to do anything meaningful. The woman in the photograph looked like she was living, not just surviving, but actually living. I wanted to be her so badly it hurt. That evening, instead of going straight home, I did something unusual. I went for a walk in a neighborhood I'd never explored before, just following an impulse, seeing where it led. I found myself in a part of San Francisco I rarely visited, full of small art galleries and independent shops. I was about to head back to the bus stop when I felt a suddenly urge to have a cup of coffee. I looked to the side and saw a nice coffee shop. I stood outside for a long moment, staring through the windows. People were working inside on laptops, sketching in notebooks, having animated conversations. Something turned in my stomach, but I pushed to open the door anyway. Inside, the space was even better than it looked from outside. One wall was covered with a community bulletin board filled with flyers and business cards. There were tables with mismatched chairs, shelves full of art books, and a corner with a small gallery of local artists' work. I ordered the coffee and then walked over to the bulletin board while I waited. That's when I saw it. A small, handwritten index card pinned among the other flyers. Seeking freelance graphic designer for small business branding project. Flexible hours, creative freedom. Contact Grace Murphy. My breath caught. Freelance graphic design. The work I'd dreamed about doing but had been too scared to pursue. I took a photo of the card with my phone, my heart pounding. This was crazy. I had a stable job. I had no freelance experience. I didn't have a portfolio ready. There were 1,000 logical reasons not to call this number. But the woman in the photograph, the version of me 1 year from now, she looked like someone who took chances, who followed opportunities, who didn't let fear make all her decisions. I finished my coffee and left, the card saved in my phone, the photograph in my bag feeling heavier than it should. Over the next few weeks, I kept noticing things, small synchronicities that might have been coincidences, but felt like something more. I'd be thinking about the photograph, about the creative life it showed, and then I'd see a flyer for a design workshop, or overhear someone talking about freelance work, or walk past a gallery showing exactly the kind of work I'd always wanted to create. But only when I was following impulses, only when I was doing things that didn't make logical sense. Taking different routes home, going to events alone, saying yes to invitations I'd normally decline. When I stuck to my routine, work, home, sleep, repeat, nothing happened. Life stayed flat and gray and unchanging. I started to understand something. The photograph wasn't showing me an inevitable future. It was showing me a possible future, one that would only happen if I made different choices. 6 weeks after meeting the photographer, I was lying in bed on a Sunday morning, staring at the photograph for probably the 100th time, when I realized something that made me sit up abruptly. I'd been so focused on the details of the photo that I had missed the obvious question. What was the version of me in that photo doing differently? What choices was she making that I wasn't? She was doing creative work, which meant she'd left data analysis. She was surrounded by people who looked like friends, which meant she'd been brave enough to make new connections. She was in a creative workspace, which meant she'd found or created community around her real interests. She looked happy, which meant she'd chosen courage over comfort. Every single thing in that photograph required me to do something scary, to leave stability, to risk failure, to show up as myself rather than as the version I thought I should be. The photograph wasn't magic. It was a mirror showing me what I was capable of if I stopped being so afraid. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photo I'd taken of Grace Murphy's card 6 weeks ago. I'd looked at it probably 50 times, but never called, because calling meant admitting I wanted something different. Calling meant taking the first step toward a life that wasn't guaranteed to work out. Before I could talk myself out of it, I sent an email. Hi Grace, I saw your posting at Inkwell Coffee about needing a graphic designer. I'd love to talk about the project. I'm currently working in a corporate job, but I'm looking to transition back into design. I know my portfolio needs updating, but I'm passionate about branding and would love the opportunity to work on something creative. Mara Bernard. I hit send and immediately wanted to take it back, but it was done. Grace replied 2 hours later. Hi Mara, I'd love to chat. Can you meet for coffee this week? My first instinct was to say no, to make an excuse, to protect myself from potential rejection or failure, but the woman in the photograph, she wouldn't say no. Yes, I typed back. I can meet Thursday after work. I met Grace at Inkwell Coffee on Thursday evening. She was in her early 30s, with short dark hair and an easy smile, and she ran a small sustainable clothing company that needed help with branding and marketing materials. "I can't pay much for this first project," she admitted. "My budget is pretty limited. But if we work well together, I'd love to have an ongoing relationship with a designer. And I can offer you complete creative freedom. I trust people who know what they're doing." Complete creative freedom. I'd forgotten what that felt like. "I'd love to work with you," I said. We shook hands, and as Grace was leaving, a man walked in, tall, with glasses, holding a battered notebook. He ordered coffee, then sat at a nearby table and started sketching. Grace noticed me looking at him. "That's Jake. He's here all the time, works on illustration projects. Really talented. You should introduce yourself. He knows everyone in the local creative scene." I normally wouldn't have. I would have finished my coffee and left, too shy to approach a stranger. But the woman in the photograph, she looked like someone who made connections, who put herself out there. "Hi," I said, walking over to Jake's table. "Sorry to interrupt. I'm Mara. Grace just mentioned you're an illustrator?" He looked up and smiled. "Jake, yeah, freelance illustration mostly. You too?" "I'm a graphic designer. Well, trying to be. I'm transitioning from a corporate job." "That's brave. Most people stay stuck in jobs they hate because it's safer." We talked for an hour. About art, about the challenge of making a living creatively, about the local San Francisco creative community. By the time I left, I had Jake's contact information and an invitation to a design meetup happening the following week. I went home and looked at the photograph again. Grace. Jake. They were the people in the photo with me. I hadn't recognized them before because I hadn't met them yet. But now, seeing their faces in real life, I knew. The photograph was coming true. Over the next 3 months, my life split into 2 versions. By day, I was still Mara the data analyst. Corporate job, cubicle, spreadsheets, safe and stable, and soul-crushing. By night and on weekends, I was becoming the other Mara. I worked on Grace's branding project, I attended the design meetup and met more people like Jake, creatives who were building careers on their own terms. I updated my portfolio. I started taking on small freelance projects that Grace recommended me for. I was exhausted, working essentially 2 jobs, but I was also alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Then came the test. 4 months after meeting the photographer, my company offered me a promotion. Senior data analyst, $95,000 a year, but with a 3-year contract commitment. It was a golden handcuff. More money, more responsibility, and a guarantee that I'd be stuck doing work I hated for at least 3 more years. "You should take it," my mother said when I told her about the offer. "That's an incredible salary, Mara. You'd be crazy to turn that down." "But I've been doing freelance design work. I'm finally enjoying—" "Hobbies are nice, honey, but you need stability. You need to think about your future, retirement, buying a house, building a real career." My father agreed. So did my friends who worked corporate jobs. Everyone with a logical, reasonable perspective said the same thing. Take the promotion, secure your future, stop chasing creative dreams that probably won't pay the bills. I had 1 week to decide. I spent that week looking at the photograph constantly. The version of me in it looked happy. Not rich, not particularly successful by conventional standards, but genuinely happy, doing work she loved, surrounded by people who got her. The promotion would make that version of me impossible. I couldn't work 60-hour weeks as a senior analyst and still have time for creative work. The 3-year contract would lock me in place while that possible future faded away. On Friday morning, I walked into my supervisor's office and declined the promotion. "I'm actually giving notice. I've decided to pursue graphic design full-time." My supervisor looked stunned. "Mara, are you sure? This is a huge opportunity you're turning down." "I know,
But it's not the right opportunity for me. I left the office feeling terrified and exhilarated. I'd just walked away from stability, from the life my parents wanted for me, from everything that made logical sense. But I had also just chosen the version of me in the photograph. The next 6 months were hard. Freelance income was unpredictable. I had to move to a smaller, cheaper apartment. I worked constantly, building my client base, networking, learning to run a small business. There were moments I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. But I was happy. Really, truly happy for the first time in years. Jake introduced me to other clients. I started getting steady work, not corporate salary money, but enough to live on. Grace's sustainable clothing company had grown significantly, and I became her primary designer. The branding work I'd done had helped her land several major retail partnerships, and she was expanding her product line.
One afternoon, she invited me to her studio to see the new collection before it launched. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out a bright yellow cardigan from a rack. "This is from the new line. I designed it thinking of you. It's called Courage Yellow. I want you to have the first one." I held up the sweater. It was beautiful, soft, well-made. "Grace, I can't accept this. You helped build this company. Your branding work is the reason we're expanding. This isn't charity. It's celebration. We did this together." I tried it on. It fit perfectly. And standing there in Grace's studio, wearing bright yellow instead of corporate gray, I felt like myself. "Thank you," I said, and hugged her. One Saturday, about 11 months after meeting the photographer, Grace texted me, "There's an art market tomorrow. Want to check it out? Jake's going too." I almost said no. I had work to do, a deadline approaching. But something made me say yes. The next morning, I met Grace and Jake at the art market. I was wearing the yellow cardigan Grace had given me. We wandered through stalls of handmade jewelry and paintings, drinking overpriced coffee, laughing at inside jokes that had developed over months of friendship. At one point, we stopped at a booth selling vintage books. I was holding my portfolio. I'd been showing them some new work I'd done. Jake said something that made us all laugh, and Grace pulled out her phone to take a picture. "Wait, the light's perfect here. Let me get a good one," she said. I was in the middle with my portfolio, her on my left, Jake on my right. The morning sun was coming through the market tent in shafts of golden light. Grace took the photo. And in that moment, I knew. This was it. This was the exact moment from the photograph I'd been given 1 year ago. I'd lived it. I'd become her, the woman in the photo who looked happy and creative and alive. That evening, I went back to the corner where I'd met the photographer. I didn't really expect him to be there, but somehow I wasn't surprised when he was, standing in the same spot with the same Polaroid camera. He smiled when he saw me. "You came. I knew you would." "How did you do it? How did you photograph something that hadn't happened yet?" He shook his head gently. "I told you, I didn't photograph the future. I photographed the version of you that already existed. She was always there, Mara, waiting for you to choose her. The photograph didn't create anything. It just showed you what was possible when you stopped resisting who you actually want to be. But the details, the people, the place, everything was exact. Because that version of you was always going to meet those people, go to those places, do that work. Not because it was destined, but because that's who she is. And once you started making choices aligned with who she is, the rest followed naturally." He raised his camera. "May I?" I nodded. He took another photo, waited for it to develop, and handed it to me. This one showed me 2 years in the future. I was in a studio space, surrounded by design work that looked more sophisticated than anything I'd created yet. I looked even happier, more confident, more fully myself. "For when you forget," he said, "that you're always becoming the person you choose to be." I took the photo, tucked it carefully into my bag next to the first one. "Thank you for showing me what was possible.
You showed yourself. I just held up the mirror." He walked away into the evening crowd, and I didn't try to follow him this time. I understood now.
I walked home through San Francisco, past the galleries and coffee shops and creative spaces that had become my world, past the life I'd built by following curiosity instead of logic, courage instead of comfort, possibility instead of security. 1 year ago, I'd been miserable and stuck. Today, I was happy and free, not because a photograph predicted my future, but because a photograph showed me what I was capable of when I stopped being afraid. The woman in that original photo, the one I'd become, she'd always existed. I just needed to see her to remember that becoming her was always a choice. A series of small, scared, brave choices that added up to a completely different life. I still have both photographs, the one from a year ago, showing the woman I became, and the one from yesterday, showing the woman I'm becoming next. Reminders that who we want to be already exists, waiting for us to choose them, waiting for us to stop resisting and start becoming. And every day, I make that choice again, to follow curiosity, to take chances, to show up as the version of myself that's brave enough to build the life I actually want rather than the life I think I should want. The photographer was right. He didn't photograph the future. He photographed truth. The truth that we're always one choice away from becoming someone different, someone happier, someone more alive. We just have to be brave enough to choose them. Have you ever made a choice that scared you but changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. If this story about transformation, following intuition, and having the courage to become who you're meant to be touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more meaningful stories every